When historians describe the transition from the old world into the modern era, they describe continuity. Cities grow, populations expand, technology improves, records accumulate, nothing sudden, nothing missing, just gradual progress. But when you stop looking at written explanations and begin examining the physical world itself, that story starts to fracture. Across Europe and North America, cities contain a shared anomaly. Streets that sit higher than the buildings beside them. Doors that open below ground level. Windows cut cleanly in stone, now buried halfway into earth. Entire floors that were clearly designed to be used, sealed and forgotten beneath modern pavement. The official explanation is familiar. Streets were raised over time. Infrastructure improved. Urban levels changed gradually. Old floors became basements. But that explanation collapses once you examine how these changes actually occurred. In city after city, street levels were raised suddenly, not slowly. Excavation records show large amounts of compacted earth already in place, not centuries of layered debris. Instead of removing sediment, cities chose to build on top of it. Entire usable levels were sealed rather than restored. Paris, St. Petersburg, Vienna, Chicago, Boston, different governments, different climates, same result. This alone is strange, but it becomes far stranger when you look at what was buried. Excavation reports repeatedly describe lower levels that were structurally sound. Finished stonework, intact walls, arches built to carry weight, foundations deeper than required for the buildings above them. These were not ruins, they were functional architectural spaces. So the question becomes unavoidable. Why would cities bury usable structures instead of reclaiming them? At the same time these buried layers appear, another pattern emerges, one that history struggles to explain. The historical record itself begins to weaken. Church registers restart. Census figures are labelled estimated. Archives describe records as reconstructed after loss. Entire decades rely on retroactive calculation instead of direct documentation. This is not one country or one war or one disaster. It appears across regions within the same narrow time window. Late 1600s, early 1700s. The same period when buried architecture begins appearing beneath cities. And yet, when history resumes, cities do not behave like places recovering from devastation. They behave like places being reoccupied. Capitals function immediately. Monumental buildings stand intact. Infrastructure appears ready for use. Roads, bridges, cathedrals, civic centres, all operating without clear rebuilding timelines that match their scale. Buildings are described as renovated, improved, or reinforced, but rarely as originally constructed. Blueprints often appear after structures already exist. Foundations are upgraded, despite showing no signs of failure. The language suggests inheritance, not creation. And then comes the final contradiction. Populations return quickly. City populations double within decades. Growth rates exceed what birth records can explain. Migration figures fail to match the scale of increase. Rural populations do not decline at the same rate cities expand. The numbers rise, but the origins are vague. It is as if cities were already prepared, and people arrived afterward. Taken individually, each of these anomalies has an explanation: urban development, record loss, migration, renovation, modernization. But taken together, they form a pattern that cannot be ignored. A world that was buried, a record that was broken, cities that survived, and populations that reappeared. This episode is not about assigning blame or claiming certainty. It is about recognizing that something fundamental changed, not culturally, not politically, but physically. Before we continue, if you appreciate investigations that focus on evidence rather than conclusions, a simple like helps this reach others who question official narratives. And subscribing ensures you don't miss what comes next. Because in the next episode, we examine the exact moment the historical record fails, why documents, censuses, and archives across the Old World struggle to explain who was living in these cities before the early 1700s, and why history resumes only after that silence. Once you see where the record breaks, the buried world beneath our cities starts to make sense. If something truly ended the Old World, the damage would not only be visible in stone and streets, it would appear in something far more fragile: memory. Because civilizations do not only survive through buildings, they survive through records. And when we examine the historical records surrounding the year 1700, something disturbing becomes impossible to ignore. Across Europe and parts of Russia, official documentation does not continue smoothly through this period. It restarts. Church registers, the backbone of population history, suddenly begin again. Baptism books resume with no earlier volumes. Marriage records appear without prior family references. Burial registers record deaths without generational context. The explanation is always brief. Records lost, documents destroyed, archives damaged. Rarely is it explained how. Almost never is it explained why the loss appears at the same time across different regions. This matters because before modern governments, churches were meticulous record keepers. Wars disrupted borders. Plagues killed populations. But records usually survived somewhere. Copies existed. Parishes overlapped. Lineages could be reconstructed. But around the late 1600s to early 1700s, that continuity fails. Genealogists today encounter the same barrier again and again. Family trees terminate abruptly. Entire bloodlines disappear into silence. The same phrase appears repeatedly in research notes. Records do not exist prior to this point. Not missing pages, not damaged volumes, non-existent. And this is not limited to families. It appears in city archives as well. Municipal records from the same period frequently admit reconstruction. Census figures are labeled estimated. Population totals are adjusted retroactively. Officials acknowledge that numbers were calculated backward, not recorded at the time. This is a critical distinction. A recorded population is observation. An estimated population is assumption. And assumptions are fragile. In some cities, populations inexplicably shrink on paper, then rise again without explanation. In others, figures are revised decades later with no supporting documentation. Marginal notes appear in census books stating that earlier data could not be verified. History continues, but on rebuilt foundations. What makes this even more unusual is that this loss of documentation does not align with a single known event. There is no universal war, no continent-wide fire, no singular catastrophe acknowledged in official narratives that could explain why archives across nations fail simultaneously. Yet they do. And when history resumes, it resumes confidently. Dates are assigned, rulers are listed, construction timelines appear, population figures stabilize. But beneath this confidence is an uncomfortable truth. Much of what comes before was reconstructed, not remembered. This raises a difficult question. Who decided what history resumed? Because when records are rebuilt after loss, choices must be made. Gaps must be filled. Continuity must be restored, even when certainty is gone. What is written becomes authoritative not because it was witnessed, but because nothing else survived to challenge it. And this is where the silence becomes meaningful. The same period when records vanish is the same period when cities begin showing signs of burial. The same period when architecture predates its documentation. The same period when populations later appear without clear origin. These are not isolated failures. They align. Civilizations usually remember catastrophe. They name it. They commemorate it. They build stories around it. But here, the record does not describe collapse. It skips it, and then continues as if nothing fundamental was lost. This suggests something far more unsettling than simple destruction. It suggests that whatever happened did not just erase lives, it erased context. And when context disappears, history becomes reconstruction. In episode 3, we examine what happens after the silence, how cities resume operation almost immediately, how monumental architecture stands ready for use, and why the world after 1700 behaves less like a civilization rebuilding and more like one moving into something already built. Once we examine the cities themselves, the silence in the record becomes impossible to dismiss. After the silence in the records, history resumes with confidence. Cities reappear on paper, populations are counted again, governments function, trade continues. But when we examine how cities behave after 1700, something doesn't line up. Because civilizations recovering from catastrophe do not resume instantly. They struggle, they rebuild slowly. Their architecture reflects scarcity, improvisation, and gradual recovery. That is not what we see. Instead, many major cities enter the 18th century already complete. Capitals function without delay. Administrative buildings stand intact. Roads, bridges, ports, and civic centers operate as if they were never interrupted. There is no widespread record of massive reconstruction projects matching the scale of what already exists. And when construction is mentioned, the language is revealing. Buildings are rarely described as being built. They are described as renovated, reinforced, improved, expanded. These words matter. Renovation implies something already there. Reinforcement implies pre-existing strength. Improvement implies inheritance. In city after city, blueprints appear after buildings are already standing. Engineering drawings explain structures that exist rather than guiding their creation. Foundations are upgraded despite showing no signs of failure. Walls are thickened, not because they are weak, but because they were already substantial. This creates a contradiction. If cities were rebuilt after disaster, where are the construction gaps? Where are the decades of temporary structures? Where are the phases of architectural trial and error? They are missing. Instead, architecture resumes at a level of sophistication that suggests continuity of skill, but continuity of skill requires continuity of people. And that continuity is precisely what the records fail to show. Even more unsettling is the speed. In several cities, monumental buildings appear within decades of supposed founding or recovery. Structures requiring immense labor, precise engineering, and coordinated planning stand fully realized without any documented apprenticeship phase. Chicago is a clear example. After the Great Fire, the city does not rebuild cautiously. It erupts into neoclassical civic architecture almost immediately. Buildings that resemble old-world capitals appear in a frontier city with no prior architectural tradition to support that level of execution. The explanation given is training, European influence, imported expertise. But training does not replace experience, and influence does not create mastery overnight. The same pattern appears elsewhere. St. Petersburg, officially founded on marshland in the early 1700s, displays architectural cohesion and scale within decades that rivals cities centuries older. Palaces, boulevards, and infrastructure appear fully planned, fully integrated, and structurally ambitious from the very beginning. This is not organic urban growth. It is occupation of a prepared space, and the foundations confirm it. Across many cities, engineers report encountering foundations deeper and stronger than required for the buildings above them. Load-bearing capacities that exceed necessity. Stonework designed for structures heavier than what currently exists. Why would a city build foundations for something larger and then place something smaller on top? unless the smaller structure was not the original one. At this point, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. Cities do not behave like they are being built. They behave like they are being reused. The streets are already wide, the layouts already coherent, the infrastructure already integrated. What changes is not the city. What changes is who occupies it. And that brings us to the most uncomfortable part of this investigation. If the old world ended around 1700 and cities survived, then the question is no longer about buildings. It's about people. Because cities without populations are useless, and populations do not appear from nowhere. Yet in the decades that follow, city populations surge. Numbers double, then triple, often faster than birth rates allow. Migration is cited, but migration requires origin points. Rural populations should decline. Records should show displacement. Often they do not, which means the next question is unavoidable. Where did the new population come from? In episode 4, we confront the most sensitive question of all: how the world refilled. Why millions of people appear in records with no traceable past. Why institutions were built to process children with no documented origin. And why the recovery of civilization looks less like survival and more like replacement. That is where this investigation leads next. If cities survived the catastrophe and records went silent, then the final question is unavoidable. Who came next? Because a city without people is not a civilization, and civilizations do not recover without population. Yet in the decades following the early 1700s, something extraordinary happens. The world refills. City populations rise at speeds that strain explanation. Census figures double within a generation. In some cases, they triple. Birth records do not support this growth. Rural populations do not decline enough to explain urban expansion. Immigration is cited, but the numbers never fully align, and the documentation becomes vague exactly where clarity is needed most. Margins note adjusted estimates. Totals are revised years later. Origins are generalized or omitted entirely. History records that people appeared, but struggles to explain where they came from. At the same time, institutions begin expanding rapidly to manage a very specific problem: children with no past. Across Europe and North America, the 18th and 19th centuries see the rise of massive orphan systems, foundling hospitals, intake homes, state-run child processing institutions. Records repeat the same phrases again and again. Origin unknown, parents deceased, no family identified, details unavailable. Orphanhood has always existed. War creates it, disease creates it, poverty creates it, but not at this scale. Entire systems were built to absorb children without documentation, without lineage, without traceable history. In some cases, children arrived in groups. In others, infants were deposited anonymously and processed into the record with a new identity assigned. This is not just social care, it is demographic management. In the United States, the orphan train movement relocates hundreds of thousands of children across the country. In Europe, foundling hospitals process similar numbers. The timing aligns with rapid urban repopulation and expanding labor demand. Children become citizens. Citizens become populations. Populations fill cities that already exist. And once entered into the system, these individuals become history. New family names, new records, new lineages, but very shallow ones. Even today, millions of people cannot trace ancestry beyond the early 1700s. Family trees terminate abruptly. Church records restart without explanation. Entire generations appear without documented parents. This is not random loss, it is systematic absence. At this point, the patterns converge. A physical world partially buried, a historical record interrupted, cities that resume without rebuilding, and populations that appear faster than biology allows. None of this requires a single global apocalypse. It does not demand one dramatic event recorded in legend and myth. What it suggests instead is something quieter and far more difficult to see. A correction, a large-scale disruption that erased population density and institutional memory while leaving much of the physical world intact. Stone survives where people do not. Infrastructure endures where records fail. And into that prepared world, new populations move. They do not build the cities. They inherit them. They do not remember the past. They are taught it. Official history smooths the transition. Gaps are filled. Dates are assigned. Construction is credited. Continuity is restored on paper, even where it did not exist in reality. This is not presented as deception. It is presented as necessity. Civilization requires narrative. Narrative requires continuity. And continuity can be reconstructed when memory is gone. This investigation does not claim certainty. It does not assign motive. It does not offer a single name or event that explains everything. What it does show is alignment. Buried cities, silent records, inherited architecture, replacement populations. Individually, these are anomalies. Together, they describe a world that did not simply evolve, it resumed. If the catastrophe of 1700 truly ended the old world, then the modern world is not its direct descendant, but its successor, built on top of it, living inside it, and largely unaware of what came before. And that leaves us with one final question, not about the past, but about ourselves. If this world was inherited once, how many times has it happened before? This concludes the investigation, but the evidence remains. Buried beneath our cities, hidden inside archives, and waiting for those willing to look without assuming the story they were given is complete.